The pivot table feature is perhaps the most technologically sophisticated component in Excel. With only a few mouse clicks, you can slice and dice a data table in dozens of different ways and produce just about any type of summary you can think of. A pivot table is essentially a dynamic summary report generated from a database. The database can reside in a worksheet or in an external data file. A pivot table can help transform endless rows and columns of numbers into meaningful presentation of the data. One minor drawback to using a pivot table is that, unlike a formula-based summary report, a pivot table does not update automatically when you change information in the source data. This drawback does not pose a serious problem, however, because a single click of the refresh button forces a pivot table to update itself with the latest data. A pivot table requires that your data is in the form of a rectangular database. You can store the database in either a worksheet range or an external database file. When you create a pivot table, you are basically trying to summarize one or more of the data fields. Now let us look at the basic pivot table terminology. As you can see here, column field is a field that has a column variation. So that is here, say, region. Data areas are the cells in the pivot table. So any cell is a data area. Grand total is available below. Then we look at group. So you can group several of the items. So you simply select them using the control button, right click and say group. Next, an element in the field that appears as a row or column header is called an item. Next, we look at the refresh button. The refresh button is available in the pivot table tools options. Then we look at a row field. A row field is anything that has a horizontal appearance. So here, marketing head, group 1, operation manager are all row fields. Finally, we look at source data, that is the data with which the pivot table was constructed. So this is the source data for the corresponding pivot table. And finally, we look at subtotals. So you can also total each row or each group separately. So now let us look at how to create a pivot table. Simply select any cell in your source data, go to insert table and pivot table. The pivot table field list pops up. Place a check mark next to the item at the top and Excel will place them in one of the 4 boxes below. You can drag it later to any required box. You can also alter the styling of the pivot table. Let us look at these in the worksheet. So first choose any cell, go to insert pivot table. You can give a name for the pivot table. You can choose where you want the pivot table to appear, either in a new worksheet or in the existing worksheet. Suppose it's an existing worksheet, you have to choose the cell where you want it. Now we have given it in a new worksheet. So let's put a check mark against the fields that we want. As you can see, it is directly being put in any one of the boxes. You can then drag these fields to whichever box you want. So as you can see here, it has been summarized as sum of salary, count of region. So these can also be changed. So you can simply click on the arrow on the right and go to value field settings, and you can see the various options here available that you can use for summarizing your data. You can use the design tab to choose any design that you want and change the look of your pivot table and make it more presentable. You can also add blank rows, change the report layout, add subtotals and grand totals. You can also change the name of the pivot table here, use the refresh button, use formulas, create pivot chart, use sorting, etc. from this tab. Next, there is also an option to group pivot tables. We have already seen this in the previous part. So we will move on to the next topic. Here we will be looking at creating frequency distributions and a pivot chart. So first we create a pivot table as usual. And now to create a frequency distribution, we need to group this. So suppose we want to see how many students are in each band of marks. So how many are in 30s, how many are in 40s, etc. This is how you do it. You first group the 10s together. So group the 70s together, 80s together. So now we have got the count for each group, and we can name them accordingly. Now simply click on any of the cell in the pivot table and go to pivot chart under the options. Now you can see the pivot chart displayed. And this is very similar to your normal chart. Next we look at creating a calculated field or calculated item. A calculated field is a new field created from other fields in the pivot table. So suppose the source is a worksheet table, and alternative is to add a new column to the table and create a formula to perform the required calculation. A calculated item uses the contents of other items within a field of the pivot table. If the source is a worksheet table, an alternative is to add a row and write formulas that use other row values. First we look at creating a calculated field. Select any cell in the pivot table. Go to pivot table tools, options, formulas and calculated field. Now we are trying to find the average of the English, math and science marks. So give the name as average. The formula you say equal to, and you can double click any field in the bottom so that it appears into the formula bar. Once you have typed the formula, you can create add, and you can see that it has appeared in the box, and then say OK. So now you can see the average column has appeared. Next we look at creating a calculated item. Click any cell in the row labels, go to calculated item. So suppose the first 5 students are in section A and the last 5 are in section B. We are trying to find average of each subject for each section. So first we find out for section A average. You can select items from the right hand side box by double clicking them. So first we click the marks of first 5 students. Say add and OK. Similarly you can also do for section B average. Next we look at using the report filter option. You can drag any field into the report filter box. Here we are taking region, and now you can filter the pivot table according to region. So suppose say north or west or south. Now we have filtered it according to south. Suppose you want the count of employees, simply drag the designation into the values box and it turns into count of designation. So here you can see how many people in each designation are in each area. By using a pivot table, you can convert a huge table of data into an attractive printed report. But the usability or the usefulness of a particular pivot chart depends on what type of data you are representing and how exactly you are summarizing it. This ends the video on pivot tables.